All right, today on Cause 3D, we're gonna build the Mandalorian Jetpack. We built this back in season 1. You can find it on our Etsy store. We haven't done a build video on it yet, and quite frankly, I want one for my own collection. So we're gonna get started. We're gonna go over some pieces, and then we're gonna get to building. All right, we're gonna get started. The first thing we're gonna do, because these are 3D printed, is we are going to take some water and a towel, and we are going to wipe off, if you look closely, you can see where there might still be some adhesive on there. And it does show up purple when it gets wet, so we're just going to wipe everything down and make sure that we get all that adhesive off of the surfaces that we're touching the print beds when we printed them. Once we get all of our surfaces clean, so that there's no adhesive on there to interfere later with our gluing processes, then we're going to move over to sanding. All right, we've got all of our pieces cleaned. Now we're just going to start the sanding process. My preference is I start with my random orbit sander. I start with an 80 grit, work down to about a 120, go to about a 150, and that's when I'm going to stop sanding for a while until we get to the next step. But here we go. All right, we got the bulk of our parts sanded at this point. So now what we're going to do is we're going to move over to the 120 grit sandpaper because we just got done with the first pass of the 80. The whole point of the 80 is just to knock down any high places, knock down any seams that were left over from printing, things like that. The 120 and then the 150 following that, we're going to make a pass on everything again. There are some parts like this rocket rounded part here. I usually like to hand sand that. Start with your 80, same process. It's a little hard for me to get my random orbit sander on parts like this, and you definitely don't want to damage the part by bearing down too hard on it with your sandpaper. Let the sander do the work. Take your time. Don't stay in the same spot too long because you can melt the plastic. If it starts to look like it's going to melt, stop in that section, move on to something else, and go back to it after it cools back down. Now I'm going to finish sanding all these parts. You don't need to see that. You know what's going on. And then we'll come back with the next step. All right, at this point, we've gotten everything sanded. And it's relatively smooth. There's still some print lines in it. We're trying not to necessarily get all the print lines out in this particular part of the sanding because we're going to put on our resin later, which we'll get to in the next part. But right now, we've got to glue our side tank covers on to complete our body. So what we're going to do is grab some super glue here. Epoxy works as well. I've just found that super glue is the best. The first thing I recommend is that you actually dry fit this and make sure that you've got all the parts sanded that are going to come in contact with each other. And now that we look at it, all right, we know where we're going to glue everything here. I'm going to flip it over and I'm going to drop my glue on. I am a little bit liberal when I'm putting the super glue on because we can always clean it off later. After it dries, we can sand it back down. All right, and if you've dry fit this, you know roughly where it should land. Get it in there, stick it on there, and we'll hold it for a second. While we're doing that, I usually go back with my tanks and make sure that those are going to fit in there. If you want to stick those in before we start this glue process, there's nothing wrong with that. We just want to make sure we don't get glue on those tanks so that they get stuck in there. All right. Feels pretty good. I'm going to use some Insta-Set. I've got it a little bit here in a small bottle just so we can get it attached quickly. For the most part, everything's lining up. If it doesn't all line up just perfectly, that's okay because we've got some more steps that we're going to go in and do some fixing with on that. Make sure everything's touching as best we can here while that dries. Got just a little bit of a gap up here that we'll fix later. These tanks are not stuck in there. We'll get those out of the way now that we've got them in as a guide. And we're going to stop there. We're going to move over to the other side. Alright, so we've got this tank cover on. We're going to dry fit the other side now. Just making sure we know exactly where everything's going to come in contact with itself. And we're going to start dropping some glue in there. As I said on the first side, doesn't hurt to have too much in this case. We can sand down any squeeze out that we have. Just want to make sure that once we get it in there, it's not coming out. Looks pretty good. I'll force the back up into this piece here. Make sure it's lined up nicely. Check again, make sure that our pieces will fit. Once this glue dries, because this is permanent. That one's a little tighter up here than the last time. We're going to just move it around. Alright. This side did not line up as perfect as the other side, but that's okay. We're going to do some filling work on that on the next part. Holding, and I think we're good on this side. Drop some more Instaset in there. Get our glue to go ahead and grab. Alright. We've got our full body at this point. Now, a couple things to note. Up here we do have a little bit of an overhang. That's okay. We're going to go back and sand this down, or file this down and fix that. Got a couple gaps up here on the top. We're going to fix those with some bondo or some other filler, and everything looks good. We've got a body now. Alright, so in the course of sanding the body down here and the other parts, I do want to address a couple small issues that I have. I've got a couple very small cracks in here, which are fine gaps, I should say, not cracks, but gaps that I want to get filled. This top edge, there's a alignment issue that we've always had with this particular print that we'll show you how to fix. And then here on the bottom, where the side tank covers go on, we do have some raised areas that we're going to sand down. So I'm just going to use my Dremel, and I just put a sanding drum on there, and we'll get started on that and get that sanded down. Alright, so we weren't too aggressive with this. We just knocked off the edges here. I'll go back and hand sand this a little bit just to get it nice and smooth. And we did get into the infill right here where the, let's see if we can get that on camera, where you can see where the infill is. And we're going to go back and fix that as well with some bondo. Before we get to that part, I'm going to now go back and fix this edge. There's a gap here, this edge, and then we're going to repair what we just sanded out. So we'll get the tape and I'll show you how we're going to mask it right before we bondo it. I prepped this side now, so this is the easy side. I've just run some tape because we are going to put some bondo in this corner right here. All I had to do was tape the front and the side. The reason I use the tape is because bondo can get really messy. So all we want is to get the bondo here on this edge. So the tape will be pulled off before the bondo completely cures. So I'll show you how to do that in just a moment. But this side, we've got a little bit more of a gap. When I actually put this on, I got it just a little bit off center, and I'm talking maybe a millimeter. Most of the time, you could probably just hit this little edge right in here with a sander, get it cleaned up, it'll look fine. I'm a perfectionist. I really like to see it looking as clean as possible. So what I'm going to do is I've cut some cardboard pieces here, and I'm going to show you an easy way to prep it for bondo. So I've got some double stick carpet tape here, and we need about half of that. So I'll cut that down into a strip. We're going to take the first piece of cardboard. We just want it to seat right up next to the area that we're working. Now the reason for the cardboard is because we're going to build up a little bit more on this side than we had to with the other side. The other side was really simple. It was just a couple pieces of tape. We'll be able to get that covered with the bondo, no problem. This side is going to be a little bit different because we actually need to extend the back out a little bit. So what we're going to do is we're going to place our cardboard flush with the side over here, and we're just going to put our double stick tape in there, keep that nice and tight up against the body. We're going to do the same for the top here. So let's get that piece prepped. And if you don't feel comfortable working with actual bondo, you can use pretty much any type of filler that's out there. There are several videos on different types of filler that you can use. Bondo is just a preference of mine. I've worked with it long enough that I know how it works and what it can and can't do. Double stick tape, however, is different. It's giving me a fit here, but that's all right. We'll get it. All right. So we got this piece ready, and again, we're going to set it to where it's sticking out flush with this side. So, in other words, if you're not following exactly what I'm talking about here, let me show you. Get rid of this extra piece. We don't need that in the way. Save that for a minute, maybe later. So we'll get a close-up of this. So we've overextended it. You can see this edge. It overextends just a little bit here because we're trying to fill in this gap that's there. All right. Next thing we're going to do, since this side is the side that we want to get built up to, we're again just going to put some double stick tape right along the edge here. Sorry, not double stick tape. We're going to use masking tape on this edge. Same down here. We don't want our bondo to get all over the place because that's just more cleanup we'll have to do later. Alright, so we've got these pieces prepped. I'm going to trim my tape up so that we can also do this top corner up here, this corner. Again, we're going to need to fill in this slight holes here where we got into the infill and over here as well. So I'm going to do some trim up and then we'll get to the bondoing. Alright, we've got our bondo ready to go. So if you've never worked with bondo before, it's pretty simple stuff. We're just going to grab some of the bondo here. Don't mix up more than mix up enough that you don't have to go back and remix, but at the same time, don't get crazy with it. You don't need You don't need a ton of it. Seal up the can there, get it out of the way. We're gonna get the hardener. We're gonna add that in there. Look at the directions on the box if you're not sure how much to use. And mine just broke, so that's the end of that tube. And then we're just gonna mix it up. It's probably not a bad idea to wear gloves with this, especially if it's your first time using Bondo. Throw some latex gloves on. I've used it enough that I typically don't get it on me, as of course my stick breaks, and it's going to make that a little more complicated here in a minute, but that's all right. All right, we got it pretty well mixed up. Nice pink uniform color there. And throw that away, the mixing stick since it broke. Grab another one here off to the side. And we're gonna get started. So the first thing I wanna do is this edge right here. I threw that extra piece of cardboard over to the side. I'm just gonna reuse this for now. It's gonna work well enough. So we're gonna get a little bit of Bondo on there, and we're just gonna apply it right along the edge. This does take a little bit of practice. It's not that hard. Again, if you're too thin, that's okay. If you're too thick, you can sand it down later. It's not ideal to sand it down. And now we've got that edge pretty well covered that was bothering me earlier that I didn't like. While we're there, we're going to fix the bottom. Just going to smear it into those infill holes that we had. With Bondo, you do have a short working time. It will begin to harden, but that doesn't mean to get in a hurry and do it incorrectly. I'm going to fill the top, put some in there. The other thing to use, if you don't want to use a piece of cardboard, you can also use a credit card or any plastic card. I typically keep a stack of those just for this purpose. Again, we're going to get some on this side now. I'm not looking to completely fix these yet. I just want to get a base down so that if we decide to use a different type of filler here in a little bit, the Bondo is most definitely not going to go anywhere. All right, now let's work on this edge. This edge, the reason why the cardboard's there is to give us a nice stop so that we can get it good and high where that area is. Just smearing a little bit into the corner. Working it down. I got a little bit much there. Make sure it's in there good though. We want it touching the plastic in there so that it doesn't pop out in a minute when we take our supports off. Again, as I said, this does take a little bit of practice, but don't be afraid to try it. It's really not that complicated. All right, that looks good. We got a little bit of extra hanging off here. We got a little bit of extra hanging off up here. That's okay. We're going to address that in just a minute when we wait for this to dry. I'm going to throw my application cardboard away, but I'm going to actually leave my Bondo that I just mixed. I'm going to leave it there for a minute so that I know how hard this is by how quick this cures. So we're going to wait a few minutes. We're going to let it cure. Okay, it's only been about 3 minutes. And looks like I used a little bit more hardener than I normally do. It's almost to a rubbery stage at this point. We can wait a couple more minutes, but I'm going to go ahead and get started getting this done. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my X-Acto knife, and I've got a blob here. Just want to get that out of the way because when I pick this cardboard up, I don't want it ripping anything off here that I just worked on. So let's start with the cardboard pieces. They should just lift right off. I'm kind of pushing them towards the bondo so that we don't accidentally remove any bondo that we just applied. Got those off. Now I'm going to come in and I'm going to take my blue painter's tape that I've got on here off. This part is a little tricky. You really need to take your time with this. You don't want to get in a hurry and rip it and then have a piece of chunk of bondo come off. Alright, let's clean that up. Get that out of the way. Looks really good. Got a minor spot right in here that we're going to have to fix in a little bit. We've got a blob that's sticking up here. Like I said, this stuff is still really rubbery right now. Go ahead and remove that. I want to sand that down later if I don't have to. Take a look. Everything looks pretty good. A little bit of blowout there where we've got some that's just sticking out just a hair. It's all right. We'll be able to sand that off in a little bit. So let's get started here removing the back now, this other side. Try not to get it on your hands, obviously. This stuff doesn't smell all that great. It is pretty strong. While it was in the middle of curing, we did turn the shop ventilator on so that we weren't breathing the fumes. And we're about ready to turn it on again to get rid of the last of the fumes. Again, I'm going to take a quick look, make sure everything is pretty well. There's another small bubble there that I want to get rid of now. I don't want to sand that off later if I don't have to. Okay, so it looks pretty good. So what we're going to do is we're just going to set this aside for a little bit. We're going to let it cure. It's not perfect. Let's see if we get a close-up on that. It's not perfect yet, but that's okay because we have a little bit more filling to do in there. And then when we come back, after this cures, and again, read the directions on your bondo to find out what the cure time is. We'll come back, we'll do some sanding, and we'll move to the next step. Okay, we've got our side tank cover bondo work done, our tops and our bottoms, and now I'm going to work right here along this seam. The actual screen used anything has a little bit more of a gradual slope to it. So we're going to mix up some bondo here. Again, and as I said before, you don't have to use bondo if you're not comfortable with it. You could use any filler you want. Bondo is just a lot stronger than, say, a wood filler or even bondo glazing, which I'm not a huge fan of using in large quantities. So let's get this mixed up, and then we're going to take a tongue depressor popsicle stick, just like I'm using here to mix. We're going to use that also to apply in this seam so that we just get a little smoother, I guess you'd call it a swoop, back to the back top part. All right. That mixed. Grab my tongue depressor, and we're going to be pretty liberal with this. Now the reason I have the blue tape down again is the same reason we did on the last application of the bondo that we were putting on there, is because we just don't want to get it anywhere that we'll have to sand it off later. Smear it in here. Making sure that we get it in that seam. This also helps with strength. When you go to attach your hooks so that you have your Jetpack harness, this actually helps it just give it a little bit more rigidity. Looks like I mixed up just the right amount, so that's always good. We got a lot on there. I'm going to just take some out here in just a second. Alright. This corner nicely. Now what we're going to do, clean this off a little bit. I'm going to use it to drag it up through here. I'm getting the point of it as deep in there as I can. Just going to remove the excess that we put in there. And in a moment, we're going to remove the tape. This just helps us. The less you use, really the better, just because of weight. I do like to keep the weight down on these. We're going to let that cure for just a couple minutes. We're going to come back over here to this and check and see how hard this is getting, how fast it's curing. And when we get close, we're going to then, when this starts getting a little stiffer, we're going to peel our tape off. Okay, we let it sit for a couple minutes. We checked our stuff over here and it's still rubbery, just like we want it. What we're going to do is we're going to very carefully peel it off, but we're going to peel it off away from the bondo that's on there so we don't lift it. Taking our time, making sure it doesn't release anywhere we don't want it to. It's a little crooked, that's okay, because we're going to come back and we're going to use our finger later to just sand it back down nice and smooth if there's a small line or anything there. Alright, so we got rid of that hard edge where it comes in and attaches, so we're in good shape there. At this point in the build, if you run into a problem of any kind, you can take a pencil if you wanted to, and you can come in and just pry it all back out of there and try it again. That looks good, so we're going to let this cure, and then we're going to move on to another step after this. Okay, well, this finishes curing up here. We're going to move over to the sides and the bottom that we bondoed earlier now that it's cured, and we're just going to sand it down. I'll show you that process. Alright, looks like we got it pretty good. We're a little light right here, so a little bit of hand sanding will blend that in nicely. If you're a little low on a side where you've still got a little bit of an indentation, you can put on another coat like we did in the last step. If you're a little high like I am just on here, I'm actually going to switch my sandpaper over to a little higher grit to get that knocked down and finished up a little nicer. But other than that, we look pretty good, and we'll move on to the next step once this top piece cures. Okay, we get to one of my favorite steps. We are going to take our photosensitive resin that we use. I've got an Elegoo printer, and I found out that for filling the print lines, we did a rough sand, knocked off the high spots, but there's still print lines in every piece that I have out here in front of me. This stuff expedites sanding so much. So I've knocked it down a little bit. Now we're going to use the photosensitive resin. I don't use this particular resin in my 3D printer because I'm constantly dipping it out, sticking my paintbrush in and so forth. So this is what I call my dirty mix. Sometimes it's gray, sometimes it's got different hues in it, just depending upon what color resin I'm using at the time. So I've got a cheap chip brush here, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start by showing you we just paint it on. It's that simple. If you understand how the Jetpack goes together at this point, you don't have to paint every single piece, every single part, just the parts that show. I'm doing this one. I like to paint this one fully. We'll go back and sand off what we don't need. This piece right here, if it's good and smooth, it actually adheres better when we glue it to the piece that sits on top of it. Again, I'm only doing the tops of these, that are parts that are going to be seen. Trying not to make a mess out of it. I want to show you this one real quick because this one gets just a little bit trickier. So we're going to go in around these vents. We're going to be really careful not to get it pooled down inside there. If you do, I'll show you how I get it out. Go in, my brush is relatively dry, there's not a lot of resin on there. Just going to go in ever so lightly, coat that in there. Make sure we got it nice and smooth, no runs. If you have a mess up in there, you can grab a toothpick, you you go in and you can clean out any excess that may have pooled. Looks pretty good. Guess we do want to get the side here as well. There's only one other piece that you need to see that's I do a little bit differently. So as soon as I get this one coated, we'll move to that piece. And the rest of it's pretty much rinse and repeat, self-explanatory. Again, once our photosensitive resin cures, we're going to be able to sand it back down and it's going to be really smooth. This piece here, I typically like to put some tape on the threads because I don't want to get resin in the threads. Makes it harder to get the part on and off. So let's get that nice and coated. And then what we'll do is we'll stick this into our UV curing chamber that we built for a few hours. Let the resin cure. We'll sand down any globs or runs that we might get on this. We'll be ready to go on. Alright, so we've already got everything's cured on these pieces. I've begun sanding everything on your left side of your screen there. So these pieces have all been sanded. I did notice there are some places I need to go back and either redo with some resin, or we'll just bondo and spot putty some of these deeper cuts that are in this that I didn't fix with just a quick resin cover that we've done. I've also resined the back here. It's ready to go, and I don't put too much work on the back of the Jetpack because obviously you don't see it. But next step for me is I'm going to finish here in just a moment. We're going to resand this or sand this area for the first time where we let the bondo cure, and I'm going to finish sanding all of these pieces. So now we're going to sand this bondoed area that we did the other night, and I'm just using some 240 here, and we're just going to get in here and sand it and blend it as best we can. As I've said before, just let the sandpaper do the work. And we're going really gentle and just getting this smoothed out. Take your time. We've got that. I'm going to jump over to a 350 grit just so I can find out where I have any trouble areas that I may need to go back and fix. And remember, we have not put the resin or any type of sealer on this yet to get rid of our print lines. So we just need to get it close with the bondo. It's looking pretty good. I may go back and work on it just a bit more if I find any other spots. But other than that, we're going to finish sanding this. We're going to move over and put a resin coat on this, let it cure. And that's the end of the part 1 video. Stay tuned for part 2 because we're going to continue with the actual build part next. Now that we've got all the pieces ready, like and subscribe. Make sure you hit us up on Facebook under Cause3D and send us a message if you have any questions.